Ralph, thank you for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today. You have so much to share with us, and we have such a short period, so we'll get started right away.
Okay.
Your parents met in 1933, the year that Hitler took power in Germany. They moved to Holland in 1936 before you were born. Before you talk about your parents' move to Holland and their life with you during the war and the Holocaust, tell us what you can about their early lives and the events that led to them wanting to move to Holland.
Okay, the experiences focused primarily on my father. Both of my parents lived in Krefeld, Germany, from 1935 until my father left the country. He was harassed by people on the street. He was beaten up several times. They painted swastikas on his house and on his father's store. But the incident that really made him, or convinced him not to remain in Germany, was the following. He worked in the store that my grandfather owned. He worked in a materials department, and there were several other ladies that worked there. One of them accused my father of raping her. And so my father was arrested and put on trial. And very fortunately, during the trial, the young woman was called to the stand, and she just said, "I'm sorry, I can't go through with this. He didn't do it." So they released my father, but they arrested the woman. We found out after the war that she spent a couple of months in jail, but was also released, fortunately. My father then sort of organized to try to leave the country. He tried to make arrangements to come to the United States, but as you probably know, the United States borders were essentially closed to Jews, so that was not a realistic possibility. He did have some acquaintances in the Netherlands, and he thought they would be better off there than remaining in Germany. So he made various arrangements to go to the Netherlands and to set up a business there. In order to succeed, he needed to have money, and the Germans would not allow Jews to take money out of the country. So my father converted all of his assets, as well as some of his father's assets, to three things: diamonds, gold, and silk. And the primary reason for that is they were relatively easily transportable, and my father also had to hide them when he crossed the border because it was against the law for Jews to take property out of Germany. So my father hid his diamonds in the radiator. He hid his gold coins in his tires. There used to be inner tubes between the inner tube and the outer tire. And he hid the silk in the upholstery of the seats in the car. And he ended up going across the border 5 different times. Each time he took some assets, and he also brought some of his relatives. So my mother came with him. Both sets of grandparents who were very reluctant to leave Germany because both grandfathers had fought in World War I. They had been decorated soldiers, and they felt that they were Germans first, not Jews. And so they had to be convinced to leave the country. Ironically, they probably would have been better off in Germany. More Jews survived, a larger percentage of Jews survived in Germany than in the Netherlands. It's very difficult to find a place to hide in the Netherlands. It's totally flat. There's hardly a hill in the country. The cities are relatively small, and everybody knew everybody. And so we were very lucky to survive, and all 3 generations of my family survived the war. We were hidden together part of the time, but we were also separated part of the time.
Ralph, you said that your grandparents at first were reluctant to go.
Right.
Was your mother willing to go readily, or did she want to remain behind?
I think she had ambivalent feelings. My father had I would call a paranoid personality. Long before what happened with the Nazis, he was always skittish about where he was and who was looking out and what might happen to him. And of course, after the incidents that took place, in his hometown, he really felt like he had no choice. And since my parents had been recently married, I think my mother had no real choice. I think if she had had a choice, she probably would have stayed where she was.
If you don't mind, tell us about that one incident as he's going back and forth taking the goods illegally when he went across with his friend who seemed to have been sort of a wise guy.
Yes, okay. So my father had already been across the border several times. This was his last time going across the border. And he told his friend, just keep your mouth shut. It's dangerous to go across the border, and they've become much more suspicious, so they're checking things much more carefully. And so they went through everything in the car. They didn't find anything. My father, in that instance, had hidden some diamonds in his toothpaste. And the man sitting next to him, as they're leaving, he says to the guard, you guys were so careful about everything, but you didn't check our toiletries. And my father, sort of gasped and said, and of course he didn't know where the diamonds were hidden. My father had never told him. Anyway, the guards just sort of laughed and went on. And my father, as soon as they got out of view, he stopped the car, trying to catch his breath, and he said, why in the world would you say something like that? He said, well, I just thought it was funny. And my father said, it wasn't funny because that's where I hid the diamonds, and if they would have found them, I wouldn't be able to proceed. Anyway, so they did get across the border. He ended up being a partner in my father's business in Amersfoort.
Once your family was in the Netherlands, what was life like for them in the first couple of years they were there? Were they able to get themselves reasonably settled?
We were very lucky. My parents had some contacts in the Netherlands. They were able to set up a store, much like the department where my father worked in his father's store. So he sold material goods, not finished dresses, but material goods that seemed to do pretty well right in downtown Amersfoort. He also bought a very nice house, what I guess in the United States you would call a duplex. It's connected to one house on the next side. We lived I would say, a middle-class life, and things went relatively smoothly. My parents joined a synagogue, which was probably a mistake because that sort of haunted us afterwards. And I think they lived comfortably. When the Germans invaded in 1940, the Dutch resisted for 7 days. They didn't have much of a military, and they were never expecting to have to go to war. So when the Germans occupied the Netherlands, initially they just sort of stayed there and collected information. They weren't in the process of arresting a lot of Jews, but by 1942, it became very uncomfortable, and my parents did feel like they had to go into hiding. In order to go into hiding, my father had contracted with a friend to build a little cottage on a farmer's property. He built this cottage with the permission of the farmer, and it was basically out of the way. There was no road leading to the cottage. There was enough shrubbery around so you couldn't really see it from anywhere. And if somebody hadn't told on us, we probably could have survived there for the rest of the war.
I'm going to ask you a question about that. He built that cottage, I think, in the latter part of 1940, right. But you didn't move into it till 1942. So he was making that kind of careful, complicated planning well in advance.
Yes.
Until they exercised the option to go to the cottage in 42. What was that time like for your family and for your parents living under the Nazi occupation as of May 1940?
Well, they tried to live a normal life, but it became more and more difficult, and people became aware of the fact that they were starting to arrest Jews, that the Dutch police were complicit with the Nazis in many cities, helping them find the Jews and deporting them. So my father, during that time, from 1940, when the Germans invaded, until we went into hiding late in 1942, we took weekend trips in the car with canned goods, which they stored in the cottage. So by the time we moved there was a lot of food. I mean, not great food. There was a potbelly stove in the cottage, although my parents were reluctant to turn it on or to build a fire because the smoke would indicate that somebody was there. So we didn't use that very often. There's no running water. There were no toilet facilities or anything, but we felt relatively safe once we got there, and at least we had stored a substantial amount of food, which hopefully would have lasted. We stayed there for 9 months before we were forced to leave.
Ralph, what precipitated for your parents to make the move into the cottage? It had sat empty for a year and a half. What caused them finally to make the decision to go?
Well, I think the primary motivation was the awareness that there were Dutch people that they knew, or friends of Dutch people they knew, who were being arrested, taken to Westerbork, which was the transport facility where they stayed for a week or two before they were sent to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. And the more people that were being arrested, more fearful I think my parents became, until they felt like they weren't really safe where they were living. And so
it was time to go.
It was time to go.
You
yes.
shared with me that when they made the decision, your parents sat you and your sister down to have a conversation about your new identities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Dutch underground was very helpful during the war. They were also subsidized by the Dutch queen and her husband, Prince Bernhard, who was German, but who was very supportive of the Jews. So they provided money. They escaped to London, where they thought they'd be safer than in the Netherlands. So they supported the underground, and the underground provided false identities, for one. So we had false papers. All of us had false papers. We also had false names because they thought our names were too Jewish, and so we all had a more Dutch-sounding name. Everybody had to have their hair dyed blonde, so we would look more Aryan. I didn't have my hair dyed blonde because I had blonde hair as a child, and so I was lucky. The most disturbing part was when my father tried to explain to my sister that she wasn't who she thought she was. That she had a new name, and my sister didn't want a new name. She said, "Why do I have to give up my name?" And my father said, "Well, you have no choice. You know, it's very dangerous, and you have to have a new name." And they were fighting with one another. And even after the war, my sister was still upset about what happened. But anyway, that was the first time that my father ever slapped either of us. He finally said, "You know, you have no choice," and he smacked her in the face. And he said, "You know, you are not Marion, you are Marijke." And so that was the end of the argument. And so we had this new identity, which fortunately came in very handy a number of times during the war. We had yellow stars, which the synagogue had handed out back in 1941, but we seldom wore them. And after the war, in fact, it wasn't until my parents died that I discovered the 4 yellow stars, 2 of which were slightly worn and 2 of which clearly hadn't been worn at all. So mostly we went around, if we went around at all, with our false papers and false identities.
Ralph, for the almost 10 months, I believe, you were in the cottage, 2 questions. One, were any other family members with you? And as a little boy, what do you recall of that time for you?
So ultimately, my parents and both sets of grandparents were with us in the cottage. Now, the cottage had one large room, which was basically the room where we spent most of the time, and a relatively small bedroom. So most of us spent a lot of the time when we were asleep on the floor. It was, in comparison to what we had in the chicken coop, it was a very luxurious place. And we were, comfortable there. And for the 9.5 months that we stayed there, we had enough food. Although my grandfather taught me and my sister how to pick mushrooms. Lots of wild mushrooms are poisonous, but there are some wild mushrooms that you can eat. And so that was one of the luxuries we had. We'd go outside at dawn and pick mushrooms, which I guess was the best time. You knew which side of the tree they grew on, and so we picked mushrooms. The farmer who let us stay on his property was a very religious person. He felt like it was his religious obligation to protect us. He'd given his word that he would do the best he could. And I was 3 years old when we went into hiding, and I don't remember very much until the bad things started to happen. And that was the night that one of the farmer's sons knocked on our door and said, "The Germans are coming, you got to leave immediately." So we all grabbed something and ran out the door, and I would say within 5 minutes, the Germans were there. They were screaming and yelling, something about, "We know the Jews are here. Why would anybody else be hiding here? We see all these possessions, clothes and things." And so they started looking for us outside. But very fortunately, it was a night when there was just a horrible thunderstorm with lightning and very loud cloudbursts, and they didn't look for very long. Instead, they just burned the cottage down. And so we stayed out that night. The next morning, and that's the first thing I remember in my life. The first thing I remember is spending the night in the field, sopping wet, hearing the Germans yelling and screaming, and then the cottage where we lived going up in flame. So the next morning, when we left the cottage, we were walking toward the farmer's house to thank him for the warning, and we passed the barn, and the farmer's oldest son was hanging from the rafters with a meat hook in his chin and blood dripping down. And unfortunately, that's the second thing I remember. When we discovered after the war what had actually happened, the two sons and the father felt betrayed by the oldest son, who had given up our location to the Dutch police, who then informed the Nazis, and so they came looking for us. And the farmer felt like, this was not acceptable behavior, and everybody in the family was very upset. And they hanged him from as I mentioned, from the rafters, I guess initiating their own kind of justice.
Ralph, you said that image stayed with you for many, many years.
Yes.
Yeah. Ralph, after you had to leave the cottage, your family would find refuge in, I think, 3 different locations before you ended up in the chicken coop. Right. Tell us about those other locations that you went to and why you left them before you got to the chicken coop.
Well, we were very lucky in finding places at all, because there were 8 of us. After we had to leave the cottage, everybody had to find...
So that was the 4 of you
and 2 sets of grandparents.
Both sets of grandparents together,
right.
Okay.
And everybody ended up finding hiding places in other places. People were willing to accommodate 2 people, but not 4 people, not 8 people, and not, obviously, we couldn't stay together. In fact, the first place where we came and where we stayed was with a very nice family that had 7 of their own children, and they took in my sister and me. And this family we met at the Holocaust Museum in 2017. One of his grandsons had done some research on the Holocaust and contacted me and wanted to know if I was the person that hid in his grandfather's house. And so I said, I don't know. We started talking about where it was and when that took place. And we agreed that, we were the family, or we were the kids that stayed with his family. And he told us this funny story about the fact how the kids resented us being there, because the first night that we came, we got to take a bath first. I mean, there's no running water even in that house. They had a pump, and you had to heat the water, and they'd fill the bathtub. And the way that the kids took a bath once a week, and the oldest child would go first, and the youngest child would go last. But when we were there, the two of us went first. And the kids, I guess, were very resentful that that happened. Now, we didn't have the vaguest idea. In fact, I didn't know anything about it until we met.
Just 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yes. It was a wonderful reunion. I still correspond with him. Okay, so my sister and I stayed in this, on the third floor of this house. There was a store downstairs, a bake shop, and they sell baked goods and ice cream. And we had this system that if somebody banged the ceiling 3 times with a broomstick, that we would go up to hide. And there was a ladder that went up stories in houses in the Netherlands are quite high, like 12 feet to 15 feet high, rather than what they have here, 9 to 10 feet. And so we climb up the ladder and we'd lie down in between the rafters. So unless somebody really got up there, you couldn't see people hiding there. Once a week while we were in this hiding place, my mother was allowed to visit us. And on this particular occasion, my mother was there with us. So we heard the banging on the ceiling, and we had practiced a number of times going up the steps. This is the first time where we took the ladder up with us, which was a very good idea, it turned out. So that nobody could really follow us up there. There was a little piece of wood that you could use to close the area off. Anyway, the Dutch police and the German soldiers came and were looking around. They were suspicious. They moved a piece of furniture under the way that we got up into the attic. It wasn't high enough. The German soldier sort of pushed the covering, the piece of wood that we had that closed off the area, pushed it out of the way, but he couldn't get up there. At that particular time, when we went up the stairs, my sister had taken a pussycat that belonged to the family. She'd sort of grown attached to it. When the Germans opened the trap door, the pussycat jumped on the man's head. And he had seen some yellow liquid going down the wall, and so he assumed that the pussycat had done this. And I was very fortunate. Turns out it had been my mother. She was so scared that, this was the end, that she had peed and not the cat. But they stopped looking. But we also discovered that one of the sons was, I guess, made a statement at his school about the fact that there were visitors at his house. And so the word got out that the family was hiding somebody. And so we couldn't stay at that particular place. The other thing that happened, 30 years after the war, I had these dreams, 5 nights in a row. I had the same dream of somebody putting their hand in front of my mouth and the other hand on my throat, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And I didn't know what to do with that. I just thought, I hardly ever dream. Why do I have this dream 5 nights in a row? And so I called my mother, and she said, "You can't remember that." And I said, "Well, I don't really remember, but, I am subconsciously, I'm remembering this. Do you know what it refers to?" And she said, "Well, I'd rather not tell you." And I said, "Well, I'll probably keep having these dreams. I wish you would tell me." So then she told me when she was hiding with us in the attic, she had her hand in front of my mouth and the other hand on my throat. And she said, she was extremely tense. And if the German soldiers had gotten up there, she said, it would probably have been better for you to die by my hands than if they would have discovered us. And she said she was squeezing pretty hard. And she said, "I probably would have killed you if that would have happened." Luckily, it didn't happen. But we had to leave that hiding place.
And so from there, I think you went to a home of a butcher.
Yes, we went. We went to a butcher's home, which is where my mother had been staying. And the butcher was very nice to my mother because he was trying to sleep with her. In fact, he did sleep with her, I guess, not when we were there, but before. And my mother said, what's the point of resisting if it saves our lives? And I don't think we're going to live throughout the war anyway. So she consented. Unfortunately, a couple of days after we moved into the house, the butcher's wife caught her husband and my mother in bed together, and she kicked us out immediately. Luckily, she didn't tell the police. So we had to find another hiding place. Now, there's one in between that I don't remember, but the last one where we were was at this, I would call it a mansion even by today's standards. A woman from Indonesia who could not have children had this gorgeous house, and my sister and I stayed there for a couple of weeks, and she decided she would like to adopt us. And she contacted my parents through the underground, and my father came to talk to her, and she said, I would like to adopt your children. And he said, well, that's wonderful, but there's some conditions. One condition that my father could not accept was the fact that he would never be able to see us again after the war if they survived. And he said, I'm unwilling to do that. And so he didn't give us up for adoption. And this is the other thing. My sister used to fight with him. Even when she was, 60 years old, she was still fighting about, how can you make a choice like that? If we could have survived, in this woman's house, why would you risk, taking us back and finding other hiding places? And my father said, well, if we were going to die, you were going to die with us. And that seemed to be, but you didn't die. Anyway, so it wasn't the wrong choice. Anyway, so we had to leave that house. She didn't want us anymore if she couldn't adopt us. And so the final place that the underground found for us was a pretty horrendous place near Arnhem, a chicken coop.
And it was a literal chicken coop.
It was a chicken coop. The chickens were there hours before we moved in. The odor was just horrendous. There were no windows. There was a door. There was just a metal mesh over a hole that was the window. And it was pretty disgusting. But it was a place to hide. It wasn't in it wasn't in the city. Nobody else would really know that we lived there except for the farmer and his family. The first farmer where we stayed was pretty generous. He allowed us take some things that they had left over, gave us some milk. There was this particular farmer who had a pig farm as well as a chicken farm. He warned us that if we took anything, we would be thrown out immediately. The only thing we could take was they threw things out before they gave them to the pigs, and if we found things that we wanted to eat, we could do that. So every day we looked behind his house. They sort of put a pile of garbage, and we found potato peels and the outer leaves of cabbages. And that was basically, we had no stored food in this place, so that was our basic diet during the time that we stayed there.
You were there for almost 13 months.
13 months, yes.
Until the end of the war. How many of you ultimately were in that chicken coop?
We started just with the 4 of us. Yeah. But part of the problem with hiding in the Netherlands was that after a period of time, it got more and more risky. People talked. It was difficult to get food no matter where you were hiding. In order to get food, everybody got coupons during the war. Jews got no coupons. If families wanted some extra food, it looked very suspicious. Right. And so where the hiding places where my grandparents were, they had taken care of them very well. Each set of grandparents in different places, but ultimately they couldn't stay where they were, so they all ended up coming to the chicken coop. So at the end, the last month and a half or so, we had some cousins and the grandparents and us. There were 13 people who stayed in the chicken coop. And one of the things that I remember was one night when we were asleep, half of us were asleep because we couldn't all fit on the floor, something came in the window. Seemed like a rock. The next morning we looked at it. It turned out to be a hand grenade. But luckily it didn't go off.
And any idea where it came from?
Well, we discovered just before our liberation that there was a German encampment less than a mile away. And they were, marching up and down through the fields, various properties. And I assume, I don't know if that was intentional or just, we found there were V2 rockets that would go overhead and make this horrible whistling sound almost on a daily basis. When I walked in the fields one day, I found a dead body of a German soldier. I don't know, what happened, why they didn't retrieve him. Although days later the body was gone, I don't know who took it.
But Ralph, you told me that your mother was a very meticulous person. What was it like for her to be living in the circumstances that you described?
It was horrible. I mean, she always kept a very clean house, everything in order. She was a great cook. It was, repulsive to her. She tried to, there's no running water, although there was a stream nearby. We had a bucket, and so you could bring, a bucket of water to the house and had a broom to try to clean it. But I would say even after a year, this place still smelled. And it was just very difficult to tolerate. So it was a very hard time for my mother. But my mother didn't look very Jewish. And so when we went out, which was not very often, but my sister and I both got sick several times, had to be hospitalized. It was my mother who took us on the back of the bicycle to the hospital. And very fortunately, she knew a doctor that was willing to see us and treat us, but not leave records behind.
The worries about health must have been profound. That many people, 13 months, somebody's going to get sick.
Well, yes. Yeah. I think my sister and I were the ones that got the sickest twice. Yeah. And were hospitalized, and after the war, we had to be treated as well because we were still sick. I had this disease on my skin called scabies that create very many rough spots, itchy, and very annoying. And you see these little things crawling on your skin. I also had worms that were eating the little food that I had. They were eating some of it inside. So that was a very difficult time. The farmer did allow us to stay in his. We had planes going overhead and dropping bombs, as I mentioned, and sometimes they got pretty close to where we were staying, and so the farmer had built like an underground bunker, reinforced concrete, and he would be able to close it, and it was a relatively safe place. I don't remember exactly how many kids the farmer had, but it was a large family. Brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, children. They all stayed in this bunker, which was maybe 4 by 6 feet. And when we were in there, we were all crowded in like sardines. And it was worse than being out in the chicken coop. It smelled horribly, and you couldn't breathe. And so we went there 3 or 4 times, and then everybody decided it just wasn't worth, going in there. And so we stopped going. Just before we were liberated by the Canadian soldiers, 2 German soldiers came by the cottage and knocked on the door and talked to my parents and said, we knew you were here for months, and we didn't do anything. If we are put on trial after the war, would you speak on our behalf so we're not punished? And my parents, said, fine. Yes, we'd be glad to do that. They didn't know. We didn't know that you were aware of our presence. Anyway, they asked if they could come over and play bridge with my parents. And my parents felt like, well, they couldn't say no, but they certainly didn't want to do it. And there was they actually came.
To play bridge.
To play bridge, yes. And that was, my parents said to us, my sister and me, they said, make as much noise as you can. We don't want these people here. Of course, during the whole war, we were supposed to be quiet. And it was very difficult for us to make noise. They stayed for, I don't know, an hour and a half or so, played bridge. And the next day, there was music and bands, and everybody was celebrating. And we walked out to the street, and we were being liberated. That was May the 5th, 1945. And Canadian soldiers liberated us, and they handed out treats. They handed out chewing gum and Hershey's chocolate. I'd never eaten chocolate. That became my favorite food. I'd never chewed gum, and I chewed it for a while and swallowed it, and discovered afterwards that you're not supposed to do that. But we were liberated. You'd think that meant, now we were free, but it wasn't quite that easy. We wanted to go back to our house. Our house was occupied by 2 German officers, and they claimed they had title to the house, which they did. Not legal title, but they had title to the house. And my father had to take them to court, which took, 2.5 months to finally get them evicted.
2 German soldiers.
2 German soldiers, yes. They lived there. Anyway, he finally did get him out of the house. One of the things I didn't tell you about my father's preparations before...
I was going to ask you about this. I know you're going, yeah.
Okay. So before we went into hiding, my father had a pretty nice car. He knew that he couldn't keep the car during the war, and so he took the car apart. The chassis stayed in one garage, the engine stayed in another garage, and the wheels stayed in the third garage. So the pieces by themselves weren't useful to anybody, really. After the war, my father remembered where he had stored each part, and he got somebody to put the car back together. So while we didn't have a house to live in, at least we had a car to get around in.
You told me, Ralph, that your mother said the reason that she married your father, if I remember this correctly, was because he was unlike anybody else. And from what you've described, leaving the pieces of a car in different places with the expectation that maybe later I'll be able to put it all back together, plus all the other preparations.
Right. He was very intuitive. He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was somewhat paranoid. And he was, he could somehow anticipate what was going to happen in many instances. He was both a successful businessman and a very careless businessman. During his lifetime, he was a millionaire 3 times. He was also bankrupt 3 times. I'll give you one example. He owned a brake factory in the Netherlands after the war, and it was doing quite well. Unfortunately, one day they had a fire, and the factory basically burned down. He tried to claim his insurance until he discovered that he'd forgotten to make his last insurance payment, and so the insurance paid nothing. And he, had a loss of, I think, over $1.2 million. The good thing about that was he could use that loss for future reference so that he could deduct that on a yearly basis from his taxes. So for years, he didn't have to pay taxes because he had all these losses.
Ralph, you, as you mentioned earlier, you and your sister had been ill. After the war ended, you both had to get some pretty major treatment. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the doctor at the hospital helped us during the war, but we were both pretty sick. We were obviously very malnourished. We were lucky to get 1 meal a day during the war, and nobody really liked what they had to eat. I guess we were very weak in the sense that we couldn't really fight diseases. So my sister actually was hospitalized for a couple of weeks after the war. She was extremely constipated, and they had a really difficult time treating her. She ultimately was sent to Switzerland, and she stayed with this family there for a couple of weeks after the war. This was a very religious Jewish family, and when we came to visit, I didn't know all the rules that applied, but you're not even supposed to turn a door handle to open the door. You're not supposed to take a handkerchief out of your pocket to blow your nose. And of course, I violated all the rules, and that wasn't looked upon very favorably. But anyway, they treated my sister very well, and she was happy that she found some place where they fed her and took care of her. As I mentioned, I had this terrible skin disease and these worms. They were able to treat the worms to some extent with medication. But my mother used to, at night, she used to, sort of embarrassing, she used to try to find the worms by looking up my rear, and, she'd catch some. And, it was, they eat around your anus, and it made it very sore and uncomfortable. And my mother had to do that for, probably a half a year after the war until they were finally all gone.
Ralph, what was it like for you to go to school after the war?
It was very difficult. I don't know why, but my parents didn't, when they were preparing for going into hiding, they didn't take any books. They didn't take any toys. They never taught us to read. And they spoke Dutch, but with an accent, because they were German. And so when we were liberated and started going to school, we were pushed back to the lowest grade. We had to learn things from scratch. We spoke with a funny accent. We were in the school, at least I was in the school, where there was only one other Jewish boy in the grade school. And the kids, basically didn't know what to make of us. We were uncomfortable. We didn't speak right. We couldn't read or write. And so, I don't know, I felt like an outcast. We were liberated, but in another sense, we weren't free. It wasn't a place where certainly I didn't feel comfortable. And after the war, my parents felt like they had to make up for lost time. They had friends, and many of them did survive. And so they went out every night. They went out to party. And my sister and I were sort of left behind with babysitters, with my father's secretary. And they were very nice to us, but somehow, we didn't get to experience the same kind of freedom and liberation that my parents were finally able to, endure. And so that was hard.
Yeah. Ralph, we're not going to have time to hear about what it took for you to come to the United States and adjust again to a whole new set of circumstances here. But before turning to our audience, if you'd like to do that with some questions from the audience.
Yes, I'd be glad.
Before we do that, I want to ask you, your parents lived very long lives. I think you're passed away both in 2006 at ages 97 and 94.
Right.
They stayed, they came here. Your sister stayed in the Netherlands, right?
No, we went back and forth.
And forth.
Yes, my parents all stayed here until I went to college, which was in 1958. My mother left in 1960, went back to the Netherlands. My parents divorced and then separated and divorced. My father left a year and a half later because he went bankrupt and didn't know what to do. And so they both lived in the Netherlands for 10 years and then got back together and then ultimately retired in Laguna Beach in California.
But your sister is still in the
My
Netherlands.
My sister's in the Netherlands. She married a Dutch boy.
Yeah.
She's lived in the States about 10 years after the war and then lived in Israel for a while, back in the States. Then in 1976, she moved back to the Netherlands and has stayed there ever since.
And her health is good?
Yes, she's fine.
Good.
Yeah.
When you started speaking publicly in 1976, did your family talk much about what you went through?
Nobody wanted to know about the Holocaust after the war. It took at least a generation. My mother and I never wanted to admit we were Jewish. When I went to school here, I had no religion as far as anybody knew. I didn't tell my best friends until I graduated from high school that I was Jewish, and they somehow said they couldn't believe it. We didn't really engage in many Jewish activities. My mother didn't ever want to be in a crowd with only Jews because she thought that was going to create problems. But she had lots of friends and was quite socially active. Interestingly, where they retired in Laguna Hills, a lot of her classmates from Krefeld, kids that were in her kindergarten class. Now, this is a community
in Germany.
In Germany, yeah, they ended up. Nobody contacted anybody else to say, we're here. This is a good place to retire. And there ended up being, 7 other people from her class that ended up living in this community of about 17,000 people, which is really unusual. The German government, actually the city of Krefeld, provided an opportunity for survivors to come to Krefeld 50 years after the war. And this is how my mother discovered some of these people who lived in the same community that she didn't know about. They gave them first-class accommodations in a hotel. They went to the opera, they went to the theater, they went to museums. They treated them like royalty. I published a book afterwards, and my parents thought, God, this is unbelievable. And the Germans at that time were really very nice to try to make up for what happened in the past. Unfortunately, what's going on in Germany nowadays is very sad because there's so much anti-Semitism now in Germany as well as all over Western Europe, and unfortunately even in this country. So when I started speaking, it's the first time really that I spoke about the war was when Spielberg came. Not he himself, but his group came to interview survivors. My wife, who is a psychologist, convinced me that it would be a good time to maybe start talking about the war. Never really talked to anybody about it. And so I was interviewed by Spielberg, and that sort of started me on this process. There is a Midwest Center for Holocaust Studies in Kansas City, and when they knew that I had made this tape, so they asked me to speak publicly as well, and so I've been doing it ever since.
Let's turn to our audience for a couple of questions before we close. When we are, I'm going to, first of all, if you have a question, I have to ask you to go to a microphone. There's one right up here and one in this aisle. Make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat it just to be sure that everybody hears it, including Ralph, and then he'll respond to your question. I'll also mention that when we're done with the program, Ralph will remain behind on the stage for anybody who wants to also come up and talk with him or ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
So, Ralph, you were 6.5, your sister was 8, you said 2 years older.
Yes.
What did your parents tell you to help you put things together? And if they didn't, what would have been helpful for you to know at that age?
The question, Ralph, is at the end of the war, 6.5 and 8, you and your sister, what did your parents tell you to try to help you put your life together, as you said? And if not, what would have been helpful to have been told?
Very interesting question. My parents basically, they didn't talk about the war after the war. And they thought maybe by not talking about it that nobody would remember. My sister very reluctantly talks about the war. She would never start a conversation about it. She will interact with it if you start talking. After I made this tape, and my sister came to visit us after I retired in San Francisco, and I made a tape there as well for the Northern California Holocaust Center. And I convinced her to, have her recorded, which she did. I would say my parents did nothing really to help us deal with it. They tried to avoid it as much as possible. They thought I probably wouldn't remember anyway, which unfortunately I do remember things. I don't know what they could have told me. It would have been helpful if we probably would have discussed it so that all of us could have worked it out more successfully together, but that never really happened. My parents didn't start talking about it really until they were in their 80s.
Okay. We have 2 questions over here. Yes, sir.
During the war, did you or your family take part in any Jewish holidays?
During the war, were you or your parents able to take part in any Jewish holidays?
No, I'm not even sure we knew what day of the week it was after a while. My parents were not very religious, and no, we didn't take part in any of the holidays during the war.
Okay, thank you.
Were you upset by your dad's decision not to let you be adopted?
Or were you upset by your father's decision to not let the lady adopt you?
I'm not sure I really thought about it in the same way. I really liked the house where we were living. It was, it was this being royalty. We each had our own bedroom for the first time in our lives. It was a, beautiful house with, they had, lots of good food. I was very happy there, but I don't think I thought about it at that time in the same way, although I guess in part philosophically I agree with my sister. I think, try to do for my kids what, would be the most likely thing for them to be able to survive. And then, you might argue after the war, if you survive, try to get your kids back. But I don't, my father was very stubborn. And, when he made up his mind, there was nothing that was going to change it. And so I wasn't upset then, but I think it was probably the wrong choice.
Thank you. I think if we have real quick questions, we can do both of you.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think is the major reason of why there is now a rise in anti-Semitism in Europe?
Why do you think there's rising anti-Semitism in Europe? That's a complex question.
Yeah, I think people who are, not doing very well in their lives always look for scapegoats. They're never responsible for what happens. They always try to find someone else who's responsible. And the Jews have been, easy victims for hundreds of years. I just think, unfortunately, the tide has sort of turned back to trying to find a group that is successful, and they blame it on, Jews, they own the banks, so therefore they have a lot of money. Therefore, their lives are better than others. And it's true, a lot of Jewish people do own banks and have become successful. It's not that, that they haven't worked for it. I think I think there's discrimination worldwide, but why it's always against the Jews is very difficult to tolerate. And it is. My sister lives in the Netherlands, and it's become very difficult there as well.
Okay, our last question before we close our program. I will ask you, after her question, stay with us because we're going to hear again from Ralph to close our program.
All right, so this question is most about your father. You said your father slapped your sister. With the whole Holocaust, did that cause your family stress, and did this cause your family stress, and then do you guys took it on each other or something?
I'm having difficulty hearing you, but the question I think is, when your father slapped your sister, that was related to the stress that was going on for them? Yes. And
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, there was obviously a lot of stress during the war, and it's very uncomfortable for a whole family to live together in a place where you can't really escape. After the war, after the Spielberg tape, there was a psychiatrist in Kansas City that volunteered free services for anybody who made a tape who was disturbed by revealing all this information. So I went to a psychiatrist. I ended up going for over 25 years. Things that happened during the war stay with you and have an impact on your daily life. The best part that happened is the Germans paid reparations to my parents for what they lost during the war, and so they always had some extra income. And the Dutch government paid for their cooperation with the with the Germans, and so they paid for my therapy after the war, so got some benefit.
I want to thank you all for being with us. I'll let you know that we will live stream all of our programs until June 6th. Otherwise, all of our programs are on the museum's YouTube page, so you can view any of our programs as you wish. We also hope you will come back. At some point, we'll continue our program through August 8th. I'm going to turn back to Joel to close I'm going to turn back to Ralph in a moment to close our program. And when he's done, our photographer, Joel, will come up on the stage and take a photograph of Ralph with you as the background. So we want you to stay there for this really terrific photograph that Joel will take. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. So I'm going to turn to Ralph for his last word, and then when he's done, he will remain on the stage. That's okay. We invite anybody to come up on stage and ask the question you didn't get to ask, or just shake his hand or say hi or whatever you'd like to do. Ralph?
Okay, the last word I usually have is about connected to the last question that I got about anti-Semitism. I think when I started talking in 1976, I was very hopeful that, if the information got out and if enough people knew what happened, that it wouldn't be repeated. I can't count the number of genocides that have taken place since that time, and unfortunately, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And in response to the question, it's getting worse. I mean, Germany had really done a very good job of recognizing what their role was during the Holocaust and basically honoring those who survived and sheltering them. It's gotten to be very difficult. Even in a place like Germany, there's an alt-right party that has come into power to a certain degree. They have substantial followers. They have rallies all over the country. And when I read the newspapers, which I do all the time, and see the news, unfortunately, it reminds me of the Second World War and what happened. And it's really scary. When we came to this country in 1951, they had the McCarthy hearings, which my parents said, oh my God, I thought we escaped, this kind of autocratic rule and people just pointing a finger and having that person arrested. I see the same thing happening nowadays. It's like, nobody follows the rules and people are being persecuted. And I hope if I leave you with any impression, I hope the impression I leave you with is that people have some responsibility, not just for themselves, but for one another. I always ask myself the question, if somebody knocked on my door, a stranger, and said, I'm being persecuted for no reason, will you put me up for a while? I hope I'd say yes. I mean, that's how I survived. But I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I think I'd say yes. When I had kids, I was more reluctant to say yes, but I would say now. And I guess that's the message I'd like to leave you with. There's something I hope that you can do. And whoever speaks out, whoever does something for someone else, that'll be a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.